Good afternoon, folks. We really appreciate you joining us here. I want to also thank the FPA for hosting this event, the Fiduciary Caliber Risk Tolerance Assessment. A couple housekeeping items. We do have a large group today, so you are on mute, but you can type any questions that you have into the chat box, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. My name is Mark Friedenthal, and I am the founder and CEO of Tolerisk. And Tolerisk, just briefly, is a software as a service tool that provides a two-dimensional risk tolerance assessment framework primarily for fiduciaries and those that are becoming fiduciaries. The presentation is being recorded, so for those that may have registered but not be in attendance, they'll get that thereafter. Now, this is not intended to be a demonstration of Tolerisk, although we will use some screenshots from the system really just as a way of illustrating certain concepts that we'll be discussing. If you do have interest in seeing a demonstration of the technology, you can do so by going to our website, which is tolerisk.com. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So let's start first by examining regulatory definition. This one came from the SEC. FINRA's definition is really quite similar. Really, the point is that there are two different dimensions, two concepts related to a client's risk tolerance. One is their ability to take risk. One is their willingness to accept risk. Now, interestingly, the regulators reference original investment. That would not be my personal choice in how to define it, but we did pull it from their site. Let's talk about what the experts discuss when it comes to fiduciary standards for risk tolerance assessment. So what Michael Kitces is articulating here is that in addition to the fiduciary duty of loyalty, which everybody talks about, acting in the client's best interest and putting the client's needs first, there's also a duty of care. Duty of care is really all about diligence, and it really is meant to say that advisors, fiduciaries specifically, should be incorporating readily available information into the advice that is provided to a client. Certainly, something as important as advice on a risk directive. And the Institute for Fiduciary Standards really pointing out that there's a responsibility to collect and incorporate the relevant and available information both at the inception as well as ongoing, certainly in investment matters, and they mentioned specifically risk tolerance. So let's look a little bit at the evolution. You've all seen certainly countless examples of the old standby quizzes, generally 7 to 10 or 12 questions. They have several personality questions, often a couple of questions based on time horizon, how old somebody is, how far out their retirement horizon is, things like that. The outputs are based on averages. So depending on each answer, the output ticks up or down on a linear type scale. So that's been the status quo for several decades and is still quite prevalent even today. Now, we've seen some migration to utilize technology. So we've seen those quizzes turn into software, and now you can embed it on your website. You can send a client a link. Some of those outputs aren't as categorical as they were. You know, it's not just aggressive, moderate, conservative, but it's also some quantitative representation of those simplistic quizzes. So you get, as we note here, you get a lot of precision. You haven't necessarily improved the accuracy, but you've made the experience more interactive, and you've made the output more granular, more precise. So where are we now? So now we actually have the ability to incorporate cash flows, expenses, savings, multiple tax statuses, things like capital expenditures, the things that are periodic, that aren't all the time, that things that might be occasional rather. Same thing with capital inflows, whether it's the sale of a business or a piece of property or even an inheritance. These kinds of capital inflows can also influence and affect someone's ability to take risks. So really what we're saying is now we can separately examine someone's willingness to accept risk and their ability to take risk, and we're proud to really be a pioneer in that way. So what is the common process? As we mentioned, it's that short form, often called RTQ. What are the failures? What are the weaknesses? Well, we said they're one-dimensional. So you're not able to separate these two distinct dimensions, which is a problem. They really aren't related to each other. They're really independent of each other. Using average adjustments. So when something like someone's age or proximity to retirement is used, it's an average relationship that's incorporated. And one of the challenges, as you can imagine, is that there's a lot of variance around those averages. So on average, as someone gets older and approaches retirement or moves through retirement, yes, on average, their ability to take risks does have some reduction, but the magnitude, the trajectory, and even the direction can vary rather significantly. And I liken this to an example of if you go to your doctor and your doctor says, well, for someone in your age category, the average person has high cholesterol, so here's a script for Lipitor. The reality is that, of course, your doctor wouldn't really do that. They would actually take more measurements of your health and determine whether or not you would really benefit from that particular prescription. Financial planning and investment advisory services are moving and evolving in that direction, where we're no longer forced to use very average type adjustments, and we can be much more custom tailored to the client, help them make better decisions. Okay, so what do advisors do now who don't have access to technology at this level? They're generally, especially the fiduciaries, they're making back-of-the-envelope adjustments to those simplistic, linear, personality-oriented profiles. So if there is a large purchase of a piece of real estate happening next year, the advisor will clearly recognize that and make an adjustment as to the ability for this client to take risk. Same thing if you had triplets going to college next year and so forth. Very often, though, the situation, the scenarios are not that simple. They're much more complex, and so back-of-the-envelope adjustments don't often do that justice, and that's a challenge. Now, the typical process really lacks granularity. We talked about those RTQs. They often have an output that is aggressive, moderate, conservative. They're not that granular. They're not that specific, and that can be a challenge as well. If you're only left with 3 or 4 buckets, making changes can be rather large changes, and it introduces a large degree of luck, frankly, on when those changes might occur. So now, as we mentioned, the paradigm is really a two-dimensional, two independent dimensions. And you see in this illustration, willingness is really one independent axis, and their ability to take risk is really a separate and independent axis. And it's really the intersection of the two that would be representative of their risk tolerance at any one point in time. So we're going to take a look. These are some screenshots, some illustrations here. So once both dimensions have been measured, here we see in this example the client's willingness score is 80, their ability score is 65. You'll see above their tolerance score is 65. It's the bigger constraint at that time. Now, one of the companion statistics that's very helpful for fiduciaries when conducting this type of assessment is to evaluate the soundness, the reasonableness of the client's premise, of their assumption. So in other words, as a fiduciary, you don't want to provide advice to a client on something as important as a risk directive unless there's reasonable confidence that the premise, the set of assumptions, is fair and realistic. So in this example, we show that the probability of running out of money is 7%. If that probability had been 47%, then advisors and clients alike would generally agree that that is probably not an acceptable or realistic situation. So rather than provide advice based on that, the advisor is going to counsel that client, coach them on one or more of the following: either planning to simply work longer, if that's a viable option, spend less, save more, downsize or monetize something in retirement. So in other words, if you want to retire when indicated, then you may have to sell that vacation property in order to do that. So there's often more than one choice, and there's often a combination of dials in a sense that can be altered, but that's a really important concept. You don't want to provide advice based on a flawed premise. In today's day and age, with greater scrutiny placed on fiduciary standards, this is considered readily available information. And so you'll want to make sure that you are incorporating it. As with any modeling process, ours or anybody else's, garbage in, garbage out. So it's only as good as the quality of the information that's provided, but there are also ways of identifying which assumptions are most critical, and we'll touch on that in a few minutes. So this is another illustration of the concept that it's the constraint between these two dimensions. So if you look at this graph, the x-axis at the bottom is actually the age of the client. And so as the client ages from left to right on your screen, you'll see the flat line. That is representative of their willingness to accept risk. And in a good psychometric profile, you'll find that it tends to be stable. It's measuring somebody's innate risk-seeking or risk-aversive behavior and their innate personality. So it tends to stay stable. It's not to say it can't evolve with them, but again, tends to stay stable. The curve that you see is this client's ability to take risk, which will often evolve through time as they move through their cash flows. So in this illustration, we see that this person's initial constraint is their personality. Initially, it's their willingness to accept risk that is more constraining than their ability to take risk. And just for nomenclature, and you can certainly do this in different ways, the tolerance score is calibrated to be the numerator in a stocks to bonds benchmark. So just so you know what you're looking at here, I don't see what the number is per se, but let's say the ability score is 75 in this graph. That would be about 75% in equities or other risk or growth assets, and the balance 25% low-risk assets. The flat line looks to be about 60 in this chart, so that would say that the client's willingness to accept risk would be commensurate with a 60-40 type risk level. As this client ages, it looks like when they get to about 70, their ability becomes the bigger constraint, and that's really what you're seeing here. This is also helpful, as an aside, it's helpful for you and the client to get an idea of whether or not this client situation is one where they are in a flat part of the curve as far as their likely asset allocation and risk directive, or if they're in a part that's steeper or maybe even changing directions. This chart, this curve, this concept is going to be very different for each client, although this one is a little bit boring, perhaps typical, but this can look very different. It can go up before it levels off or goes down, and I think we have some slides to illustrate some of those things as well. Okay, here's another really important concept. We do routinely hear from and see advisors that have the misconception that when they conduct their financial planning exercise and they measure that client's probability of success, that is also the same or measuring the client's ability or capacity to take risk. Ability and capacity really used interchangeably. The probability of success is not the same thing as their ability to take risk. The reason that it's often a misconception is because when you have a situation where a client spends too much money, that both reduces their ability to take risk because they're using money sooner, and it also reduces their probability of success. So they coincide, but it's not that one causes the other. And we'll go through an illustration of why that's the case in a moment. So probability of success, as I'm sure you know from conducting your financial planning exercises, is based on the probability of meeting goals over some period of time. Generally, you run out a simulation until the client is, say, 90 or 95 or some specified number, modeling their cash flows, their risk level, their risk directive, and so forth. Ability to take risk is a current snapshot, and it's really about their ability to take risk with their current assets based on the future chronology of all their cash flows in and out. So let's take a look at a quick little example here. So this is a young client, 30 years old, going to work for a while. They have $25,000 and they're doing a good job saving. They have expenses, $5,000, and they expect, between pension and Social Security, they expect a total of $6,000. So they're in excellent shape, 99% probability of success. Their ability to take risk is at the maximum based on this simple little example. Let's add $25,000 for a down payment on a house in 1 year. Now, that's actually not going to really compromise their probability of success materially, but their ability to take risk now on that $25,000 is significantly reduced, and that's to reflect the fact that they're using, at least with their current assets, and maybe not all of it because they're still accumulating, but they're using these assets in a short period of time in a year. So that's your easy example if trying to reconcile these two concepts. So let's again get into some of the failures, the common weaknesses. We touched on some of these things. We're relying on nebulous nomenclature, aggressive, moderate, conservative. Those terms mean different things to different people, including different advisors. Switching between a few large categorical buckets. This may be obvious, but if this is the framework in which you are implementing risk directives with your clients, you see you can make some huge adjustments to risk at only a couple of points throughout their entire retirement or entire investing horizon. And so if you happen to pick a couple of lucky days to make these large shifts, it could work out great. But if you pick, or your client picks unlucky days, it could have a huge adverse impact on their success. And for most clients, a much more measured approach works better, and it's not always that it continues to go down, as we'll see some examples. So what else? So most assessments really focus too much on personality. So it's common that there's not enough devoted to assessing the client's ability, and when it is incorporated, and there are some tools out there that will incorporate it, but they incorporate it on a linear basis. And so that presumes that you're starting with someone's personality, and if they're younger, you're adjusting their output upward. If they have greater number of years to retirement, upward. If they're older or approaching retirement, in retirement, you're adjusting it downward, and those aren't always the case. And as we talked about, even if that might be average, the pace and trajectory, the magnitude of those adjustments can vary dramatically, and the time frame in which they occur. Frequently, there's no analysis of sensitivity to the assumptions. So you don't really know what's driving the analysis, and that can be a weakness of most processes. And as far as the evolution, so it is difficult to compute objectively that evolution through time, and as a result, it's not often done. So that can be another weakness in the process that you can remedy. So let's talk about what the process actually is. Now again, this is not a demo of Tolerus, but we grabbed a few screenshots just to give you a high-level feel of what a kind of a best-in-class type of process might be. So we do recommend a psychometric profile. We're not going to go through all these questions, but these questions are typically about how you see yourself, how you believe you compare to others, how you believe others see you, how you identify prior behaviors and anticipated behaviors and things along those lines. You may want to have different questions that compare and contrast and ask concepts in different ways so that you can isolate inconsistencies and things along those lines. You will ask basic questions about time horizon, age and retirement horizon, because that's part of how you'll map out cash flows for savings and expenses. Ideally, you'll do this across different tax statuses, which is really helpful, and that will make it more robust. You'll do it, oh, here's a screenshot. We find most advisors prefer to have all this information in a consolidated form. So even though you might want to send your client a link and it'll walk them through, as you saw the last few screens with some sliders and dials and more of a TurboTax style, when you're looking at it, most advisors prefer to see it all kind of in one place, which is what you're looking at here. So separating out the cash flows by spouse is helpful when it comes to retirement assets primarily and retirement income. Concepts like RMDs or when certain retirement income is received, especially if you have clients of different age, that can be important. So here you have some basic savings across tax statuses, expenses. We also allow capital expenditures, and this is helpful to identify as how it may impact someone's ability to take risks. So here you have college, a wedding, you might purchase a property, something like that. Inflows would be things like selling a business, downsizing a house, might even be receiving an inheritance or something like that. So you'll want to be able to model these kinds of cash flows, even though they may not be regular cash flows. So some of the other helpful things that you may want to employ in a fiduciary caliber risk tolerance assessment is identifying how each assumption impacts your output. And part of this is helpful if you're ever finding that the output is not intuitive. This will be a way to help you see what's driving it, help you understand it better. It'll help you explain it to the client. It's also very helpful because clients don't always know the answers to the questions that you're asking them. Sometimes they guess. Sometimes they tell you they guess. Sometimes they might not tell you they guess, but it's not uncommon that they guess. So this type of analysis, these are called parametric shocks, these are really helpful because if a client guessed, you'll know if that guess is sufficient because it's not changing a decision now, or if this is a critical assumption and you need to spend some time delving in deeper. We do it both on the ability to take risk. Here it's effect on probability of running out of money, which we'll touch on as well. So these can be really helpful to kind of quickly assess the assumptions that have been used in the assessment. So here are some examples of different scenarios and different shapes of how ability to take risk might be impacted. So in this case, this is an example where somebody has a large withdrawal. So you see on the left screen, their ability to take risk is well below their willingness, but then it shoots up. And it shoots up because some large withdrawal has already happened. So the remaining assets, picture somebody buying a house per se. So the remaining assets may have a much longer time horizon. Maybe it's retirement. And so the remaining assets have much greater ability to take risk. But until that withdrawal occurs, on average, the ability has been reduced, and that's reflected here. And you see here, we actually the ability goes above somebody's willingness and eventually comes back below as they approach and move through retirement. Here's one where the client's ability steadily goes down as they age. Sounds just like those averages. But in this case, this is a much more conservative personality. So notice here that the constraint is always their willingness to accept risk. So even though they're aging, it actually has no impact on this individual whatsoever because it never created a greater constraint than their willingness to accept risk, their personality. And here's one where, again, it's always above, but it's flat. Here's one where ability is not changing. This might be somebody who has, here we said a retiree that's living very conservatively, spending less than their Social Security and pension. They have no major capital withdrawals. They're not putting any kids through college or buying any properties, so their ability is completely flat. Now that could have been above or below their willingness to, actually I guess in this example their ability would be the maximum. So, so it is also above their willingness to accept risk. Here's one where we have a 55-year-old client who will retire at 60 and is delaying their retirement income, their Social Security and pension, until 70. So guess what? At retirement, at 60, relatively early, their ability to take risk is reduced. But as they receive that retirement income at 70, their ability to take risk is much higher. So they're slowing the pace of their withdrawals, and that's why their ability to take risk goes up. So one of the things that a lot of planners face is that they've already, and their clients have already selected an asset allocation before the financial planning process is done or redone. So in other words, they're doing a financial plan based on an existing asset allocation. And the challenge is that if the probability of success, or we use probability of running out of money because we layer on mortality probabilities, which we're going to touch on in a few minutes. But if that probability of success is too low, or probability of running out of money too high, then that can influence the changing assumptions needed to rectify that can have an impact on someone's ability to take risk and thus their decision about an asset allocation. So it actually is much more powerful to do these things concurrently than it is to do your financial plan with an asset allocation already selected. So there are two additional analytical innovations I want to mention that we've pioneered here that I think you'll just find interesting, and it helps us in this process of computing someone's risk tolerance and the accompanying statistics. One, as we've discussed, is we're computing their ability to take risk through time. And the reason that this adds a nice analytical innovation is that when we run out our version of a simulation, if you will, we can incorporate an objectively evolving asset allocation. Now, in financial planning tools, most you would hold the asset allocation constant. There are some that allow you to adjust it, but you have to adjust it in advance, and it's based on your own decisioning. It's not based on the client's cash flows. It's not computing it for you. So this is a way to better tie a more realistic asset allocation in the future. So if you're working with a 35-year-old who has an 80-20 portfolio, holding that 80-20 constant when the client is 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old may not be the most realistic or likely assumption. So having a process to objectively evolve that asset allocation as the client moves through their cash flows adds another level of robustness to your analysis. And then the other one, I briefly mentioned it, is the introduction of mortality probability. So instead of having a fixed terminus point in your Monte Carlo simulation, we actually use probability of mortality every year from current year until any conceivable end of life by spouse. And even if you have two individuals that are the same age and have the same life expectancy, we have also computed the second to die probability. And if you can picture, if you were aiming a bow and arrow at a target, you would have a certain probability of hitting that target. If I give you two arrows, two chances, your probability, roughly speaking, doubles. Maybe not exactly, but roughly. And that's kind of the concept that's really important here. The chance that one person lives to an advanced age, let's say 100, we use examples here, person A and B, 54, 55 years old. The probability of one of them living to 100 is about 2%, but the probability that at least one of them lives to 100 is 3.9%. And so all of those probabilities, that entire distribution is built into this analysis. So when we say somebody has a client or a couple has a 7% probability of outliving their money, that means that one or both of them will be alive 7% of the time that their money is gone. So it's the intersection of when they're alive, at least one of them, and a scenario where their money's gone. So we're able to simulate, using historical paths, equities, fixed income, and inflation, layering on the client's cash flows, their personality, and mortality probabilities. So this makes for another nice innovation in risk tolerance and in planning in general. Okay. So how do we scientifically measure someone's ability or capacity to take risk? We've actually used traditional fixed income and derivatives mathematics to compute the client's ability. So picture a bond or a bond portfolio where you can mathematically measure how sensitive those bonds' cash flows are to changes in interest rates or credit spreads. We've employed the same techniques to the household cash flows. Household cash flow is actually quite a bit more complex than, say, a corporate bond or a treasury note, but the concepts are quite consistent. And that also allows us to use some of those techniques to compute things like forward curves of the ability to take risk. So why is improving your risk tolerance assessment important? Now, I'm sure we're preaching to the choir, because if you're here, you obviously recognize that it's important. But determining the right investment risk is a little bit like a Goldilocks type exercise. In other words, you want to find what's just right for that client right now. If they're taking too much risk, what happens? They might not meet some obligation, or they might not stomach the volatility, both of which would produce adverse results. Now, if they take too little risk, then they're not going to get as much enjoyment. They're not going to enjoy the fruits of their labor as much. And that enjoyment can be different things to different people. It can be when they retire. It can be the lifestyle in which they retire. It could be what they leave their children, their grandchildren, their charities, so there can be a generational component, or it could be some combination of these things. Now, when you employ a more scientific process, you inspire confidence by the client, and that facilitates discipline, and we know historically that discipline is one of, if not the most important aspect to being a successful investor, being able to stick with the plan, with the portfolio. Now, sticking with the plan and the portfolio also translates to better client retention for the advisor, and also, frankly, better referrals, because those clients are confident, they make more referrals. So the two-dimensional approach also demonstrates greater fiduciary duty of care, because you are not only incorporating, but you're documenting how you incorporated the client's cash flows into the advice that you've provided. So it's really helpful from a fiduciary perspective and a compliance perspective. And speaking of compliance, the regulators love that tolerance reports demonstrate that you've documented that into advice as important as a risk directive. So how about client benefits? Well, we kind of talked about some of it. The client benefits by having something much more custom tailored to them, and by helping them have more confidence and discipline, and that really helps them achieve their results with much greater success rates. How about the advisor? Well, we talked about some of it. Some of it, that greater client confidence does improve retention and referrals, and that improved culture of compliance reduces your regulatory risk. So really both avenues are help for an advisor, especially fiduciaries. And so at this point, why don't we take some questions? Ryan, do we have questions from the audience?
We do. We have two questions, and you certainly touched on some of these things, but I'll ask them anyway. Somebody asked, is this a replacement or a supplemental tool for my financial planning system?
Yeah, it's not. It does not. The financial planning tools have historically not concentrated in this area. They generally have a simplistic risk tolerance questionnaire embedded. Some even integrate with some simplistic tools and questionnaires. We're actually working towards integration with really all of the large financial planning vendors, and we expect that in the future. So we don't do what a comprehensive planning tool does, and I don't think you'll find that a risk tolerance process is meant to replace that. There are a lot of aspects of planning, whether it's tax and estate work, or Roth conversions, or Social Security optimization, or budgeting, or I'm sure the list goes on and on. Because Tolerisk is really focused on risk tolerance, we're not getting into any of those areas, and so there really isn't a lot of overlap. There's a little bit, because in order to compute someone's ability to take risk, and in order to give you the framework to evaluate the premise concurrently, as we said, which is important, we are computing that probability of outliving your money, which is a little different than measuring probability of success, but there's some overlap. So that's sometimes why we get the question. Some use our framework as a light financial planning tool, but it certainly does not replace the large tools like eMoney, MoneyGuide Pro, Naviplan, etc. That's a good question.
The other question was whether or not we utilize a Monte Carlo simulation.
Okay, good question. It's not technically a Monte Carlo simulation. For those of you that are really into math, Monte Carlo requires the use of random numbers. There are pros and cons. We use historical paths, so we do use more than 1,000 historical paths dating back to 1926, monthly data for equities, fixed income, and inflation. So we get a very, very wide swath of scenarios as they occurred probabilistically throughout history. The advantage is that we don't have to assume that correlations between equities, fixed income, and inflation stay constant the way you would in a Monte Carlo. And we also don't get some of the very outlandish results when you're simulating for a very long time. When you're simulating, you might have a young client who's 25, and you're simulating, 70 or 80 years or more in some cases. So some of the assumptions, like interest rates, can get very unwieldy when you're simulating out that far, when in reality they don't exhibit quite that level of extremity. So there's something that's naturally serving as some boundary by using historical paths. And if somebody's interested in going into that into more depth, we can certainly do that subsequent to this presentation. Any other questions?
I think that's it.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you all for being there. I want to mention one other thing, which is that we are very proud to have the FPA join our partnership program. As such, if you are a member of the FPA, you are entitled to a discount on any subscription that you have with Tolerus. So you'll just need to contact your FPA representative, and they will give you a special code for FPA members. And as I've mentioned, if you would like to see a demo of our technology, you can do so by signing up on our website. It's www.tolerus.com, and we look forward to taking you through our technology. Thanks so much for being here. Have a great day.